Hello everyone, it's Martin aka Anders, and today I'm saying for hopefully the last time ever that I'm coming out of hibernation. Over the last couple of weeks, the collegiate semester kicked off, and so did the collegiate program that I operate. As much fun as it was trialing the 48 players and setting up the 12 teams that I have, I am happy to say that we are locked in and operating at steady state now, so I should hopefully have the bandwidth to push out content at the same pace that you guys were used to. I greatly appreciate those of you who stuck around, and as I said, I look forward to getting you content on a regular rate here soon. To kick us back into things, I'm going to be covering a tournament that I got tons and tons of questions about, and for very good reason. We're going to look at the Ashwinder Extreme Masters Pro Invitational out of Japan, the first high-profile Valorant tournament to feature agent bans. Let's hop right into it. The Ashwinder Extreme Masters Pro Invitational, henceforth AWX for the sake of brevity, was a 16-team Japanese tournament that pitted the region's best against each other, and as I previously mentioned, for the first time in a major event, hosted agent bans as part of the map selection process. This tournament was absolutely massive, with a double elimination bracket and best of threes the entire way through to the finals, which were best of 5. Spoilers incoming, this event actually saw a bit of a shake-up to Japan's team hierarchy. Absolute Jupiter, who's been compared by many to G2 in Europe, has absolutely dominated the Japanese scene. In spite of that, they were dropped to the lower bracket by Reject in the winner's semi-final. Reject would go on to win out through the upper bracket to the grand final, and not to be thrown aside, Absolute Jupiter made their lower bracket run to run back against Reject. Absolute Jupiter, refusing to upset the hierarchy in Japan, would end up beating Reject 3-1 in that final. With the formalities out of the way, let's hop right into map stats. In terms of play rate, AWX was pretty run-of-the-mill. We saw that Haven and Ascent were tied for the most played maps, with Bind coming in slightly behind and Split trailing rather significantly. Ascent and Haven sharing roughly 30% of the play, Bind having around 27%, and Split coming in at only 13%. This particular map hierarchy is super interesting to me because it's a cross-section of what we see in the other major regions. In North America, we see an overwhelming preference for Bind and Haven being the most played maps. In EU, we see a preference for Ascent and Bind being the most played maps. And here, by comparison, we're seeing a split where Ascent and Haven are the most played maps, but Bind is barely behind. This adds fuel to the fire in terms of the concept I've been talking about a bit lately, which is that Asia is a bit of a melting pot for major region strategy. This sort of even-keeled map blend that doesn't mirror either NA or Europe is very much so a support to that. Looking over at map skews, things continue to be rather interesting. We see skews that are very typical on both Ascent and Split, where Ascent has a marginal defensive skew and Split has a very powerful one. What's outside of the norm, however, is that Haven, which has a pretty storied offensive skew at this point, and Bind, which has a shorter-lived but more significant offensive skew, have both flipped in opposite directions here, showing defensive skews, one rather extreme in Bind's case. Moving on, this is where I get to have a little bit more fun than usual. Where I'd typically be hopping into agent pick rates and win rates at this stage, that doesn't really work here, because there were 2 agents banned every single map. Instead, I'm going to dive into the hierarchy of what was banned, why I think it was banned consistently, and how that affected the event's overall metagame. To kick us off, we have the top 4 bans of the event: Killjoy, Breach, Jet, and Cypher in that order. At the top, we have Killjoy with 27% ban, a full quarter of all maps played. And I'll be completely candid that I think while this ban makes sense, it doesn't make sense for the reason a lot of people are going to immediately think it does. I think Killjoy is a great agent, but I think she has a lot more conditionality compared to the rest of the agents featured on this top 4, and I think that this ban, rather than being a result of raw power level, is more reflective of a high level of uncomfortability with the newness of Killjoy. People didn't know how to play against it yet, and so would just rather not. And while this isn't a direct corroboration of that theory, Killjoy's win rate when played during this event was sub 50%, showing that when she did manage to make it through, she wasn't performing at the level of power that this ban rate would otherwise imply. Next on the list, we have Breach coming in at a ban rate of just under a quarter of all maps. Without sugarcoating the obvious, with Breach's recent changes, he's insane. We've all seen the Flash memes on Twitter and on Reddit. It's no secret that his power level is incredibly high right now. The fact that Breach really doesn't have a pronouncedly bad map also means that this ban rate makes a lot of sense. There's not a lot of explaining that's necessary here. Next up, we have Jett at an 18% ban rate. If you follow quite literally any NA pros on Twitter, you know exactly why this agent was banned. Whether warranted or not, people are terrified of and hate playing against this agent. While from a compositional dynamism perspective, locking out Jett doesn't change dramatically how teams are allowed to play the game, a lot of teams didn't have the natural pivot points that you would otherwise expect from them. If you take away Jett from their primary AWPer, a lot of them didn't have the option of flexing that AWPer onto something like a Raze, and so when this Jett went out, it changed compositional diversity on a massive level. Moving to the last on the list, we see a pretty significant drop to a 10% ban rate for Cypher. I don't know that I've been super vocal about this in the past, but I'll go on the record now saying it, that to this day, I believe Cypher to be the single most powerful agent in the game in terms of irreplaceability. In coordinated play, you can take the map control and information gathering that Cypher provides and hand it to a competent IGL. The mid-rounding that then enables is so powerful in a competitive setting that you cannot or should not ever want to give that up. This ban is super interesting because it's saying not only are we opting to not bring that to the table ourselves, but we want to see how you operate without it. This was especially the case in the few instances where we saw double Sentinel bans on both Cypher and Killjoy. The extent to which teams had access to map control had almost wholly evaporated, and that's actually a perfect transition point because there's a few other specific ban pairings that recurred a few times that I want to look at. The first of these pairs I want to look at was actually the most common ban pairing throughout the tournament, Killjoy and Jett. This particular pairing I started referring to as the anti-entrenchment strategy. Basically what it's saying is that we want to disable your ability to play a hyper-passive, hyper-defensive op meta setup, and we want to streamline our own ability to make aggressive, fast-paced executes, often relying on heavy multi-man stacks through single corridors that would otherwise be acutely punished by an untradeable op hold. Next up, we have the one that I just mentioned, the Killjoy Cypher double Sentinel ban. This one is of particular interest to me as a strategist because it says we're going to take away your ability to control the map if you don't have manpower actively placed somewhere. It exponentially increases the value of effective flanking, while encouraging defensive play that uses spread defaults and aggressively timed fast rotates. In the absence of map control, a lot of the teams who are playing on these Sentinel-less maps would, instead of playing those spread defaults, opt to play full stacks on one site and play full retake on the remaining 1 or 2 sites if you're playing Haven, saying instead we don't want to increase the value of flanks and would rather rely on our ability to full 5-man retake than give you that level of flexibility across the map as a whole. This last pairing I affectionately refer to as the Reyna bans, not because it includes Reyna obviously, but because it pushed Reyna's play rate to one of the highest points we've seen from her since her release. If you start gutting flash options out of the game, unsurprisingly, people will play the ones that are left over. And while Omen already has incredibly high play rates the world round, what this did to Reyna's play rate in particular was absurd. The global average for Reyna's play rate since patch 1.07 was just under 23%. In AWX, that was almost 54%. Now that we've touched on the most prolific bans as well as some particularly compelling ban pairs, there's 2 others that I wanted to make note of, not because of their prevalence, but because of their focality. The first of the 2 is Phoenix, who saw an 8% ban. The second of which is Sova, who saw a 5% ban. While neither of these are particularly awe-inspiring, what is where these 8 and 5% ban rates were located. They were concentrated on specific maps to an extreme level. For Phoenix it was Haven, and Sova it was Bind, but in both, the agents were banned in more than a third of the total times those maps were in the tournament. Moving on, I want to get into compositions, but I'm going to handle this way different than normal. Bear with me. To start off this section, I'm going to kick off with a graphic from the video that I never released on my patch 1.07 meta speculation video. It's one of the named compositions I expect to define the meta. I called it the same old. Pay no attention to the capitalized letters, I'm not implying anything about who I expected to play this. Since I made that graphic, however, given how map pick rate dynamics have changed, I've shifted where I expected the pivot point to be. Where I originally thought we'd see a switch between Raze and Sova between things like Split and Bind, what I think is actually going to end up happening more and more is a preferential shift between which flash a team prefers, Phoenix versus Breach. Even beyond that, however, and the one that's most pertinent to AWX, is the most played composition from this tournament, which is precisely this comp, but bringing in Reyna. Ending up being the only comp with a noteworthy presence over the others, this showed up 23 times throughout the tournament. This isn't any sort of surprise, as it's a composition that leans very heavily into the playstyles that we've seen constantly up until now throughout the entirety of the Ignition series. That said, this was also one of the first events where we saw significant and widespread compositional diversity. Let's take a look at some of the closeout events from the Ignition series. We have the Level Clash 2, which saw 35 maps played and a total of 16 unique compositions played. Pop Flash, 34 maps played and 22 unique compositions played. And most recently, Rise of Valor in OS, with 75 maps played and 31 compositions played. It has consistently been the trend throughout the Ignition series that the number of unique compositions played throughout a tournament was roughly half that of the total maps played. That was the case until AWX. With 73 maps played, AWX saw 70 unique compositions. This single event in Japan, with a sole rule set change, doubled the level of compositional innovation in their event. If any tournament organizer or Riot employee is watching this, and you want to encourage more compositional uniqueness in your events, we just found the key, and it's as simple as a single agent ban per side. Which brings me to my ranty outro and what would have been the "what I wish the meta would be" segment of my 1.07 meta speculation video. The days of a single composition holding 40 to 60% meta share should be long over. For whatever reason, and seemingly across all regions, there's an unspoken armistice, where no one's willing to light the fuse on compositional innovation. There are no hyper-aggressive compositions, no hyper-defensive compositions, and rarely even map-specific picks. I'm going to show you two compositions out of my own playbook that highlight the type of map-specific and playstyle-enabling compositions that I wish were more prolific in this game. The first of which is a simple double sentinel, which I've included multiple variants of to reflect evidenced regional preferences in agent selections. While many teams have opted to choose either Cypher or Killjoy on personal preference, there are few to no teams who consistently pick them as a pairing. Not only this, but if I were to truly pull a page out of my playbook, this would be triple sentinel. While many people like to think that Sage is dead and buried, the reality tends to differ. Since patch 1.07, where Sage was supposedly gutted, she has shown the highest non-mirror win rate of any agent in the game at 54%, closely followed by Cypher at 53.7%. That's not to say that agents with high win rates or non-mirror win rates are universally powerful, or you could just slap them together in a composition and expect it to be effective. But it stands to reason that with Triple Sentinel, the chokehold of map control that you would have access to would invariably have value, and the fact that it's not even been experimented with is frankly a travesty. This checks one of the two boxes that I wanted to make note of here with a hyper-defensive composition. What would it look like if teams started bringing in hyper-offense? And that brings us to my favorite naming of a comp that I've had yet, the Super Flash Bros. This composition enables a hyper-aggressive style that's only even been remotely attempted recently by Team Liquid with their smokeless triple flash comp. I believe these compositions, and a third variant with Phoenix and Reyna as the two primary flashes, are the next evolution of this composition. It plays forward, it plays fast, and is the embodiment of the meme of holding W. The team smokes and slices the map, eventually flashing out of their own smokes to aggressively and mercilessly take sites. Cypher, who originally plays as flank coverage, follows with the spike, but in a unique twist that this composition enables, planting the spike is often not even going to be the goal or necessary. The depth of durable smokes and the volume of flashes this team has access to means that they shine most on the hunt, and in many cases, instead of planting the spike, will win purely off of kills as they continue to push and take map control until all of their utility is gone. It is so oriented for offense that taking a defensive post-plant position will inherently put it at a disadvantage. It presses W and doesn't let go until the round is won. I'm not going to sit here and say that these compositions are omnipotent or perfect or anything even marginally approaching that. What I am going to say is that they have easily rationalized and clear power levels that haven't been tested by pro teams in a competitive setting yet. For whatever reason, teams are sitting on these proven compositions and refuse to innovate. They sit on this status quo, and the best analogy I can use is it's like a nuclear arms race, where there's mutually assured destruction and nobody's willing to pull the trigger because once someone pulls the trigger, the whole thing blows up. Eventually, there's going to be a team that quote-unquote pulls the trigger on compositional innovation, and when it happens, the ones who have been sitting on their laurels all this time are going to fade incredibly fast and be left in ashes. I'm super interested in this sort of stuff, as I'm sure you guys can tell. I've talked to Pro-Am teams in North America and Europe about it. I've talked to Tier 1 organizations, coaches, and players about them in the past, and it is stuff that I could talk about for literal hours in terms of playstyle theory and compositional theory. This is the stuff where I think my personal thought processes shine the most, and so I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on them. Are there comps that you've had in your mind where you say, this is insanely powerful on paper, I've never seen it tested, why is that? The likelihood is that it does have insane power, and the reason it hasn't been tested is because people are too scared to break the mold and sort of shatter this agreement where no one is going to innovate. I can't wait to see what happens with North America as we kick off First Strike, because I think bringing in a lot of these Tier 2 pro-amateur teams, and not just North America, in Europe, Japan, all around the world where First Strike is happening, I think giving more open access and play-in opportunities to all of these varied pro-amateur organizations is very likely going to be the thing that lights this powder keg. Super interested to hear your guys' thoughts down below. Hit me with everything you've got and more. I am super happy to be back. Thanks again for sticking around. Per the usual, you know where to find me all across the internet. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, both at AnderzzTV. Someday I might maybe eventually stream on Twitch. I'm thinking about potentially doing sort of straight up professional match VOD reviews there if I can get co-streaming rights, so look forward to that in the future. I'll be sure to let that get out there, probably on my Twitter. And as usual, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.